You know, I talked about it a little bit last week on August 13th. So it's about 10 days ago from today. A huge peace agreement between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. And a lot of people have been asking, is this the Daniel 9:27 covenant? And as I was reading, there were some interesting things that came out, and I want to share a couple of things with you. But first of all, as I looked on today, okay, this was today, in the Jerusalem Post, this was posted on August 23rd, in the Jerusalem Post, it says, Pompeo heads to Israel, Sudan, Bahrain amid talk of normalization. And so this is something that's huge because there's more Arab states that are going to get involved with this. And so a lot of Arab nations have supported this agreement and this normalization process. Saudi Arabia has remained silent right now. They haven't voiced their opinion, either yay or nay. So far, there's been a few dissenters. Okay, I'll kind of talk about those dissenters in a minute. But they're Iran, Qatar, and Turkey. Those are the three that are really, you know, feeling backstabbed by this whole situation. Okay, so I just thought that was very interesting that here, you know, 10 days later they're beginning to talk with other Arab nations. Okay, so this is getting really interesting. And let's take a look at Daniel chapter 9, because that's the question that everybody kind of wants to know about. Daniel 9 verse 27. And it says, and he, speaking of the Antichrist, the beast, in end times prophetic word, and he shall make a covenant, or shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. And that again is Daniel chapter 9 verse 27. And so when we think about this idea, this covenant that is spoken of in Daniel chapter 9, most talk about it as a peace agreement. Okay, and when we look at this United Arab Emirates and Israel, even though people are referring to it as a peace agreement, really what it is called a normalization agreement. And so they're going to go through the process of normalizing relations. And this is really amazing. It's huge. Normalization is they're going to share embassies, or swap embassies. They're going to swap ambassadors. And so they're going to open up this whole line of communication. And in fact, as we talk about communication, phone lines are going to be open, direct phone lines, direct airlines, and things like that. So when my wife and I went to Israel, and Sandra was with us, when we went to Israel in 2018, there was really no normalization in Israel. And what I mean by that is normalization with different types of religions, okay, faiths, okay, and there were security stops all over the place. I mean, we had to go through security systems, or when we're passing in from Israel to Palestinian Authority territory, there's security areas. I mean, they had blockades and all that kind of stuff all over the place. So there's really not a lot of security or normalization. Life isn't normal in Israel. Okay, so for these two nations, and now as we've seen Pompeo's talking with these other nations, that there's this possibility of making relations normal. This is amazing. It's huge. Could it be the Daniel 9:27 covenant? Well, we're going to take a look at that tonight. And so hopefully by the end of this message tonight, you'll have some questions. I don't know if I can see the questions. Maybe I can if I go to the internet part. So we'll see. All right. So first of all, I want to share with you this word covenant. If you looked it up in the King James Version, the word covenant occurs 280 times. Now, most of those times are found in the Old Testament. Okay? And the very first covenant that we see is the covenant between Noah. And that's why I thought it was such an amazing message this morning from Pastor Larry, is because he's talking about Noah's relationship and it as it was in the times of Noah. And so you know, when we talk about Noah, there was an amazing covenant that God makes with Noah. God tells Noah to build an ark, and Noah builds this ark, and it is amazing to hear from people who got to go see a life-size replica of this ark. And so that was an awesome thing. But when it was all said and done, after the ark had been built and after the flood had rained for 40 days and 40 nights, God makes a covenant with Noah and with all the people. It's Genesis chapter 9, verse 16. It's not just any ordinary covenant. In chapter 9, verse 16, we hear that it is an everlasting covenant. Okay? So God says, when the bow is in the clouds, and I will see it and remember, think about this, the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. God made an everlasting covenant with all flesh that is upon the earth, and he promised that even though the core attitude and the heart of man is always evil, is bent towards evil all the time, that God wasn't going to destroy the earth with a flood. Now, we're going to see that as Pastor Larry had mentioned this morning, that we are living in times that are just as perilous as the times that Noah had lived in. And wow, we know that the days of Noah are definitely upon us, and in judgment seems to be coming, are ready to come upon this world. But that's not the covenant that we see here in our the United Arab Emirates and the Israel covenant normalization agreement that they've made. The next covenant that we see in the whole Bible is the covenant that God made with Abraham. And this is a huge covenant. In fact, the first mention of this covenant is found in Genesis chapter 15. And in Genesis chapter 15, and I'm going to go ahead and open up my Bible and turn to Genesis 15 because I want to read directly from my Bible. But it's 15 verse 18. And here's what it says. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. So the covenant that God made with Abram, later he'll change his name to Abraham, is it's also, we're going to see in a minute, it is a covenant for land. God's going to give Abram and his descendants land. Now, what's interesting in chapter 15 of Genesis, we hear God say to Abraham, as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. That's verse 12. And behold, a dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. And verse 13 says, then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. Now, after the 400 years, God's going to punish this country that Israel, or Abram's descendants, have served, and then God's going to bring them out, this prosperous nation out, and he's going to give them this land that God has promised to Abram. So that's the beginning of this covenant that I think that we see in the United Arab Emirates and Israel. And I want y'all to catch that. The reason I say that is because this agreement, the UAE-Israel agreement, is actually titled, you ready for this? Abraham's Accord. That's what it's called. So all kinds of these covenants, they have nicknames or titles. And this covenant, the United Arab Emirates and Israel's Normalization Agreement, is titled Abraham's Accord. And so I think it has a lot to do with the covenant that is made with Abraham, that God makes with him. It begins in Genesis chapter 15, and I already read that, verse 18. But in chapter 17, we hear that the covenant is an everlasting covenant. God makes an everlasting covenant with Abraham. And this covenant, here it says, "And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you." So this is an everlasting covenant. And what was the covenant about? God's going to give them land. God's going to give them, the descendants of Abraham, he's going to give them land. And that's so, so important. Now, and I don't know if I put the scripture up there, but Genesis chapter 17 will also have the actual sign of the covenant. So in Genesis chapter 9, the sign of the covenant was the rainbow. God was signing it across the sky. This is his covenant. He's just signing it across the sky. It was the rainbow. Well, the sign of the covenant of Abraham is circumcision. And so God tells Abraham, this is your signature on this covenant agreement. Circumcision becomes Abraham and his descendants forever. It becomes their signature, their sign of this amazing covenant that God has made. All right, so let's fast forward. Remember, Abraham has been told, your descendants are going to be slaves in a country that's not their own for 400 years. Well, it took 430 years to the very day, and God brings Israel out of Egypt, and they are very prosperous. They have multiplied. They are a great and mighty nation now, okay? And so God's leading them. He leads them through the Red Sea, and he leads them to the mountain of God, Mount Horeb. And that's really important because we see our next covenant that takes place. It's the covenant of the Ten Commandments. And we see this, let me see if I got it right here. Genesis 34, verse 28. It says, "So he was there with the Lord for 40 days and 40 nights. He neither ate bread nor drank water, and he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant," the Ten Commandments. So the Ten Commandments actually became a covenant for the people of God. And that's why the chest that Moses had told the people to make is called the Ark of the Covenant, because it holds the covenant that God had made with them on Mount Sinai, on Mount Horeb. But it goes even one step further. In let's see here, in Exodus chapter 34, verse 12. Now this is so important, and I want to share this with you. Remember, the covenant with Abraham is about land, okay? And so the Ten Commandments was simply this: you obey these commandments, you obey this covenant, and I'll give you the land. And so that's huge, okay? Now, one of the situations that God warns the people over and over and over again is what we find in Exodus 34, verse 12. Exodus 34, verse 12. I'm reading my Bible here, but you have it there on the screen. Exodus 34. Verse 12. All right. It says, "Take care lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you go, lest it become a snare in your midst." Over and over again, Israel is reminded, do not make a covenant with the people that are in the land, because they will tempt you. They will lead you away from worshiping and serving God and God alone. And so that's an important part of the covenant. And then we find out in Deuteronomy chapter 29, and this is at the end, and Moses is giving them Deuteronomy. He's a retelling of this law and all these kind of things. But in Deuteronomy chapter 29, we see an additional part of the covenant, okay? And so here's what it says. Deuteronomy 29 verse 1 says, "These are the words of the covenant that the Lord commanded Moses to make with the people of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant that he had made with them at Horeb." Now remember, the covenant he made with them at Horeb was the Ten Commandments. And now everything else now is included. So Genesis all the way to the book of Deuteronomy is included within that covenant. And Moses tells them, this is what I want you to do. When you get over into the promised land, when you get over into the land that God made this covenant with you and he promised you, I want half of the tribes to stand in front of Mount Ebal and the other half to stand in front of Mount Gerizim. And I want you to proclaim all the blessings. If you do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, God's going to let you stay in the land. God's going to bless you, multiply the produce of the land. It's going to be amazing. God's going to uphold his part of the covenant, okay? And he'll give you the land that he promised to Abraham. But if you do not keep these covenants, if you do not obey the Ten Commandments and obey all these rules that and laws that God has placed before them from Genesis all the way to Deuteronomy, if you do not, then God's going to wipe them out of the land. Okay? So this was very important because in Joshua chapter 8, the people go into the promised land, and that's exactly what they do. Mount Ebal, Mount Gerizim, they renew this covenant. We're in the land. God gave us this land. It's going to be great. And then something very interesting happens. Okay? And that's what I really want to share with you today. It's Joshua chapter 9. Okay? Joshua chapter 9. As I was reading this week, this is the part that God spoke to me and said, wow, is this unfolding right before our eyes? Is this the United Arab Emirates and Israel agreement, normalization agreement? Do we see it unfold in Joshua chapter 9? So here's what Joshua chapter 9 is. It says, as soon as all the kings who were beyond the Jordan and the hill country and in the lowland and along the coast, the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and the Jebusites heard this, they gathered together as one to fight against Joshua and Israel. Israel is not, they are accustomed to having everybody against them. Okay? They are accustomed to having everybody against them. This is not unusual for Israel. Okay? But, listen to verse 3. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, they on their part acted with cunning and went and made ready provisions and took worn out sacks for their donkeys, wineskins worn out, torn, and mended with worn out, patched sandals on their feet, worn out clothes, and all their provisions were dry and crumbly. And they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and to the men of Israel, we have come from a distant country, so now make a covenant with us. So what are they wanting to do? They're wanting to come and they're wanting to make this covenant. They're wanting to make this agreement. Okay? This normalization agreement. That's what Gibeon is wanting to do with Israel. But God had warned them. Don't do it. Don't do it. All right. And so they said to Joshua, but the men of Israel said to the Hivites, perhaps you live among us. Verse 7. Then how can we make a covenant with you? Verse 8 says, then they said to Joshua, we are your servants. And Joshua said to them, who are you? And where do you come from? And they said to him, from a very distant country. Your servants have come because of the name of the Lord your God. For we have heard a report of him and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon, king of the Heshbon, and to Og, king of Bashan, who lived in the Ashtaroth. So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country said to us, take provisions in your hand for the journey, and go meet them and say to them, we are your servants. Come now, make a covenant with us. Here's our bread. It was still warm when we took it from the house as our food for the journey on the day when we set out to come to you. But now, behold, it is dry and crumbly. Though these wineskins were new when we filled them, and behold, they have burst, and these garments and sandals of ours are worn out from the very long journey. And so the men took some of the provisions, but did not ask counsel from the Lord. Now I want y'all to catch that verse 14 again. So the men took some of their provisions, but did not ask counsel from the Lord. You see, I don't think it's a coincidence that Joshua chapter 8, they renew the covenant. They do what Moses had told them to do. Mount Ebal, Mount Gerizim. They talk about the blessings and they talk about the curses. If they obey the covenant with God, then they're going to have the land. They're going to dwell in the land. But if they don't, then there's going to be curses. They're going to be kicked out of the land. And then all of a sudden, they go and they make this covenant with Gibeon. They were deceived. And I really want you guys to realize that the devil, that's one of his major arts. He is a deceiver. He is deceptive. And we have to be extremely on our guard for this, okay? And if it says anything to us, if this scripture in Joshua chapter 9, particularly verse 14 says anything, it says that we cannot make our decisions based upon what we see. And you and I are looking around, we see all kinds of crazy things that are going on in our world today. And prophetic things that are going on in our world today. And it's tempting to make all kinds of decisions, all kinds of assumptions and choices based on what we see. But the most important thing that we can learn from this scripture is that our number one job is to inquire of God. God, give us eyes to see what you want us to see, because the enemy is out there. He is the deceiver. He is deceptive. He is trying to trick us into doing all kinds of things and accepting things and talking about things. And for example, I mean, so what if this is the peace agreement covenant that's spoken of in Daniel, and we get all excited but nothing happens, and all of a sudden we lose heart, and we begin to stop believing God's word is true. And I don't want us to ever get to that. I want us to seek God's direction. But that being said, there are a lot of things that I see here in Joshua 9, the deception of Gibeon and the covenant that is made between Gibeon and the covenant that's made between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. And here's the thing that I want you guys to see about this, okay? The first is that all these other nations that were surrounded, they got mad at Gibeon. Okay, so they all came to fight against Gibeon, and it's one of the most amazing stories of God's miraculous power and His provision for Joshua. And all the people prayed that the sun would stand still and the moon would not move, and they went out and they conquered all these nations. But all those nations were mad at Gibeon. And that's really what's happened. Not all the nations are mad at the United Arab Emirates, but there are some that are. And it is coming out. You know, we always know about Iran, Qatar, and Turkey. Those are the three that have openly spoken out against this normalization agreement, okay? And even so far as Turkey is threatening to remove its embassy and its ambassadors from Abu Dhabi, which is the capital of the United Arab Emirates. And so, this can get very interesting, and we're going to have to just let it all settle out and find out how it all trickles out in the end, okay? But it is looking a lot like the Gibeon effect, this idea that one nation that is part of us makes this agreement, and all these other nations, they're going to come against Gibeon. And so we're seeing that, okay? And that's understandable, but United Arab Emirates is standing their ground, and they know that this is a big deal for them, and so they are pushing this through, okay? The other thing that I want y'all to see is how this could possibly affect or unfold into the Daniel 9, and even more prophetic is the Gog Magog war of Ezekiel 38 and 39. Okay, and I'm gonna unfold this for you real quick and easy. Okay, like I told you, Israel, it's not normal. You go there, you know you're going through security points and all that kind of stuff. It's not normal. All right, I think it was Christianity Today, and they made a comment. They made an article, and the article was, "Can Abraham bring peace in the Middle East?" And they're feeding off of that, the title of this agreement. It's Abraham's Accord. Now remember, all of these, the three major religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, they can all tie their faith to one person, and that's Abraham. Okay, so the whole idea is this is going to be amazing. This is, Abraham can somehow bring this accord, bring this normalization, and tie it all together, and this is gonna be awesome. And so, but not everybody's happy about that. You would think that everybody would be happy about peace, right? Everybody wants normalization. Everybody wants to go to bed at night not worried about destruction, not worried about war. Okay, everybody would like to do that, but the Jews, it seems, Judaism, it seems like I follow the Temple Institute, and their desire is to build a third temple. Their desire is to be able to worship God the way that God had orchestrated for them to worship Him in Genesis, Exodus, okay, Leviticus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, to how to worship Him in this manner, okay? And in order to do that, they need a tabernacle and they need this temple. And right now, even with this normalization and everything, President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu and all of these people that are part of this, they're like, you know what? Muslims are going to be able to go to the Temple Mount and the mosque there, and they're going to be able to worship the way they worship, okay? And Christians are going to be able to go to the Temple Mount, and they're going to be able to go to these other places in these Muslim nations, and they're going to be able to go to these Christian sites in these Muslim nations, and they're going to be able to worship and do what worship the way that Christians worship. But the Temple Institute is concerned that, like, okay, well, the Muslims get to worship the way the Muslims want to worship, and the Christians get to worship the way the Christians want to worship, but the Jews right now are still prohibited from going on to the Temple Mount, okay? And that's kind of a thing, is there going to be a normalization for Judaism as well? Is there going to be a third temple? Are they going to be able to have this real accord where all these relationships, all these religions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, can all three worship together, all right, their own way on that Temple Mount all over Israel? So there's not any security stops and all that kind of stuff, but there's normalization. Everybody just goes about and does what they want to do. Is that going to be able to happen? I don't know, and I really believe that that's exactly what God doesn't want, okay? Because remember, God is telling the people over and over again, do not make a covenant with the people in the land, because they're going to lead you astray. They're going to lead you to worship the way that they've worshiped. They're going to lead you to worship their idols and their gods and all that kind of stuff. And so the Abraham Accord, the Abraham covenant that God made with covenant, it's not about, Israel gets to live in this promised land and worship the way they want to, but they get to live alongside other people that worship the way they want to. No, the covenant that God made with Abraham is, I'm giving you this land. This is going to be the land of the people, of the children of Abraham, and they're going to worship me. I'm going to be their God, and they're going to be my people. That's it. Okay? There's none of this additional kind of a thing. And so why I think that it's possible, I'm going to see if I can go back up here to this one here, the Daniel chapter 9. Why I think it's possible that this agreement could go in line with this Daniel chapter 9, 27, verse 27 covenant is that the King James and other translations would say that he confirms a covenant or makes strong a covenant. In other words, that it's like a boost, or he strengthens a covenant that had been made. And so when we look through the Bible, and there's 280 times the word covenant is mentioned, and I already mentioned to you today, there's a few more that I could go on about, but I don't want to try and confuse anybody. But Noah's covenant, but today the really is Abraham's covenant, and it was a covenant with the land. And is this so? Daniel 9, the Antichrist can come along and he can say, well, let's make this covenant better. So it's not just Judaism worships the way they want to worship, but everybody else gets to worship too. The Muslims get to go and worship at the mosques, and the Christians get to go and they get to worship at these holy sites that are important to Christians, and the Jews get to go and worship at the places and sites that are important for Judaism, okay? And so it could be that type of covenant that he's making, and then all of a sudden 3.5 years, because we do know that in half of that week he breaks that covenant. He breaks the covenant and he cuts off the sacrifices. So ultimately, at some point, there has to be a normalization that everybody's worshiping the way they want to worship. Okay? Everybody's got to worship. There has to be a normalization, because Jews are going to be able to offer sacrifices again the way that they want to do it. And this could lead into that covenant that I was trying to tell you about, because it's possible, okay, Muslims get to worship at the mosque, Christians get to worship at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and then the Jews get to have a third temple, and they get to offer sacrifices, and so everybody's all in one accord, and everybody's happy, okay? So I think it's possible that could unfold into that, all right? Now let's take a look at the Gog and Magog, okay? And I told you as I went to Israel, there is no normalization in Israel. There are checkpoints. There are security stations everywhere. You see them all over the place. You go onto the Temple Mount, you see it all over, all over the place. You go into Palestinian Authority, get into Bethlehem, we went through a check station, a checkpoint. All of that. So it's important. So Ezekiel chapter 38. Okay. And so in Ezekiel 38, let's see here. All right. So let's start with verse 7. Okay, Ezekiel 38, verse 7. He says, "Be ready and keep ready, you and all your hosts that are assembled about you, and be a guard for them. After many days you will be mustered. In the latter years you will go against the land that is restored from war." So Israel had been at war for a long, long time. Okay, a land whose people were gathered from the many peoples among the mountains of Israel, which had been a continual waste. Its people were brought out from the peoples and now dwell, now hear this part, securely, all of them. They dwell securely. They're, again, you can say secure, and they're secure right now, but there's checkpoints, there's security points. They want to make sure they're secure, but the reality is, man, there are threats every single day in Israel, every day. And so it says, it keeps going, "Now they dwell securely, all of them. You will advance coming on like a storm. You will be like a cloud covering the land, and all your hordes and many peoples with you. Thus says the Lord God, on that day thoughts will come into your mind, and you will devise an evil scheme, and say, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages." So there are no more security stops. All right, think about that. I will fall upon the quiet people who dwell securely, all of them dwelling without walls and having no bars or gates. Again, we had to go through gates to get to certain territories, certain areas. This isn't happening as Israel stands right now. But normalization can happen. Okay, and that's what I think is happening, unfolding before our very eyes. To seize spoil and carry off splendor, to turn and your hand against the waste places that are now inhabited, and the people who were gathered from the nations who have acquired livestock and goods, who dwell at the center of the earth, Sheba and Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish and all its leavers will say to you, have you come to seize spoil? Have you assembled your host to carry off plunder, to carry away silver and gold, or take away livestock and goods, to seize great spoil? Therefore, son of man, prophesy and say to Gog, thus says the Lord God, on that day when my people Israel are dwelling securely, will you not know it? Will you not know it? You will come from your place out of the other parts of the north, and you make many people with you, all of them riding on horses, great hosts of mighty army, and you will come up against my people Israel like a cloud covering the land. In the latter days I will bring you against my land, that the nations may know me, when through you, O Gog, I will vindicate my holiness before their eyes. And so, before you can have Gog and Magog, you really have to have normalization in the region of Israel. You have to, because right now they are not living without the gates and the bars. They're all over the place. All over the place. So you're not going to have that. So this could very possibly be a precursor to the covenant of Daniel chapter 9, precursor to the Gog and Magog and all that kind of a battle that could take place a little bit later, because it seems like, just like we saw, there are more nations that are getting involved in this. There are going to be more Muslim nations, Arab nations that are going to get involved in this agreement, this Abraham's Accord, and they're going to come together, and maybe they can win over those three, Iran and Qatar and Turkey. Maybe they can win over those three and begin to the whole region to be normalized, so that they're so normal that Israel would take down their security gates, take down their checkpoints, because once they do that, we see that there is a war that's coming, and that's the Gog and Magog war. So, hey, yeah, that's what I have for you guys today as far as this this covenant agreement between United Arab Emirates and Israel. This is going to be a very interesting thing. It's definitely something that we need to keep our eye on, and only pray that, you know, that God's will is going to be done. Let's not be like the leaders with Joshua, that we just look at all the things that are going around and we just make assumptions, okay? And we just make decisions and choices based on what we see. Let's inquire of God. Let's seek God's direction, because God can give us eyes to see the things that are invisible. God can give us eyes to see the spiritual things that are going on in our world. And there are most definitely spiritual forces that are at play in this situation. In our country, with our elections, there's definitely some spiritual situations or circumstances that are taking place. So let's continue to be praying for God's direction and all.